They say the land in Pike County still hums at night. That if you press your ear to the dirt where Hollowbrook Plantation once stood, you can still hear the echo of boots, chains, and one gunshot that changed everything. No trace grotere now, no birds sing. The soil refuses to forget. But this isn't a ghost story. This is about control, who claims it, who loses it, and what a man becomes when he decides to take it back. Before Josiah was called the revolutionary, he was property. A number on a ledger, a breath that didn't belong to him. But something in him was awake, something that studied silence, watched power move like a shadow through the halls of the white man's house. He learned to obey, not out of fear, but strategy. Because to overthrow a system, you must first understand its rhythm. Colonel Wendell Harrove mistook patience for loyalty. That was his first mistake. He placed the overseer's whip in Josiah's hands, thinking he was creating an ally. But he was planting a weapon, one that could read, plan, and wait. And when a mind like that decides to turn, the whole world shifts. They say revolutions begin with fire, with noise. But this one began with silence, with eyes meeting across the field between the master's house and the slave quarters. With a daughter, Catherine, watching a man her father owned and realizing he didn't move like a slave. He moved like a man calculating destiny. History tried to bury this story. The county records were erased. The plantation burned. The Harrove bloodline vanished within a generation. And those who remembered whispered only one phrase, trembling as if saying it might wake something ancient. The land remembers. What we uncover here is not just rebellion, it's revelation. Because once you see how a single enslaved man inverted the entire power structure of Pike County, killed his master, took his daughter's hand, and built a world on the ashes, you'll understand something your teachers never told you. Control doesn't disappear, it only changes hands. And tonight, you're going to see how it happened. Power rarely shouts. It whispers. It hides behind polite words, measured tones, and Sunday sermons that preach obedience, while men rot under the sun. Colonel Wendell Harrove believed himself a good man, as all tyrants do. Hetais te praetes milet, and yet his hands were built from the suffering of others. When Harrove's overseer died, the plantation needed a new keeper of order. Someone to watch the fields, record the yields, keep the illusion of control intact. Harrove could have hired another white man, but greed makes men arrogant. It makes them blind. He looked at Josiah, the strongest among the enslaved, intelligent, quiet, unbroken, and thought, he will serve twice, as labor and as law. He didn't understand that Josiah's silence was not submission, it was study. For years, Josiah had watched how the world worked, how ledgers were balanced, how cotton was weighed, how authority was performed. He had seen the colonel's rituals, the cigar after supper, the key he kept on a chain, the pistol by his bed. Every small detail became a data point, every cruelty a blueprint. And when Harrove handed him the overseer's whip, Josiah took it not as a weapon, but as permission to learn everything. From that day forward, the fields became his classroom. He studied the rhythms of harvest and hunger, the way hope could be rationed like cornmeal. He began to move between the worlds of power and pain, belonging to neither, mastering both. The other enslaved workers looked at him with confusion at first, then recognition. They saw the spark. They saw the quiet question forming behind his calm eyes. What if we were never meant to bow? And Catherine Harrove, educated, restless, a colonel's daughter who read books she wasn't supposed to, she saw it too. She saw the way Josiah stood taller than any man her father called equal. She saw the danger of his calm, the dignity of his silence. And though she didn't yet know it, her gaze was already part of his plan. Because Josiah understod so meeting most man never do. If you want to destroy a system, you don't fight it hidden. You walk right into its heart and make it believe you belong there. Catherine Harrove was not supposed to think. She was supposed to marry, smile, host dinners, bear heirs. But her father made one mistake. He educated her. He let her read. And knowledge, once it touches the mind, does not obey. In the afternoons, she would sit by the upstairs window with a book open, and the world below her, the fields, the sweat, the songs of men her family owned. She watched Josiah move among them. He didn't shout orders. He didn't use a whip. He spoke with presence, the kind that commanded, not demanded. There was something in the way others listened to him, not with fear, but with belief. It unsettled her, as belief is more dangerous than rebellion. Catherine started asking questions, small, innocent things that turned into fractures in her upbringing. Wie kult a Mann so intelligent be enslaved? Why could a man so cruel be praised as a gentleman? And why, when Josiah looked at her, did she feel that same strange gravity, like standing at the edge of something vast and forbidden? In the evenings, Josiah kept to himself in the overseer's quarters. But the nights were his. He began to teach, softly, quietly. By candlelight, he taught the other workers to read the Bible. Not for salvation, but for symbols. He showed them verses about freedom, hidden between the lines. Exodus, liberation, justice. He taught them to count, to calculate, to plan. Not because he believed in miracles, but because he was building one. Knowledge became contraband. Every word learned was an act of war. Every number remembered, a weapon. And Catherine noticed. She saw the difference in their faces, the way they held themselves taller, spoke slower, carried something invisible but potent. One night, unable to resist, she asked him a question that no daughter of a plantation owner had ever asked a man in chains. "Do you ever think about what life would be like if things were different?" He looked at her, the daughter of his enemy, the symbol of everything he was about to destroy, and said, "No, I don't think about it. I prepare for it." And in that moment she understood the revolution wasn't coming. It was already here. It began with the sound of chains. A traveling coffle, 30 men, 3 women, dragged down the dirt road leading to Hollowbrook. The sound kriet like a deer getrückte Pins, iron clinking against bone, hope grinding against durs. Catherine heard it from her window. Josiah heard it from the fields. But only one of them understood what that sound truly meant. The coffle came from Savannah, bound for auction. Among them was a woman named Sarah, tall, scarred, eyes sharp enough to cut through illusion. The overseers mocked her, called her cursed. But when Josiah saw her, something ancient stirred. He recognized it, the same unbroken flame that lived inside him. That night, when the colonel locked them in the barn to rest before the next day's journey, Josiah moved through the darkness like a shadow that had learned to think. He carried no weapon, just intention. He waited until the guards fell asleep, then pressed a small tool, a sharpened nail wrapped in cloth, into Sarah's palm. "You've been caged before," he whispered. "Do you remember what freedom sounds like?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The cause freedom doesn't sound like a netting. It felt like the length before a thunder. By dawn, 2 guards were missing, and the barn door hung open. The colonel called it an escape. But Josiah knew it was a signal. Sarah was the spark, proof that will cannot be owned, proof that systems can bleed. The Plantation trembled for days, the dogs searching, the men cursing, the women praying. But Josiah said nothing. He simply went back to his work, same pace, same silence, same storm beneath. Catherine watched the chaos unfold and saw something change in her father. I could fear. For the first time, the man who controlled hundreds could not control his breath. And she saw something change in Josiah, too. His eyes no longer looked down. They looked through. That night, when Catherine brought him water against her father's orders, she asked softly, "Did you help them?" He didn't lie. He didn't confess. He only said, "Every man deserves to see the night sky without asking permission." It was not rebellion. It was prophecy. And in that moment, the first line of Hollowbrook's history began to burn. Hollowbrook shanget after Sarah's escape. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The colonel doubled the patrols, shortened the rations, and filled the nights with threats. But control is like dry rope, it frays when pulled too tight. Josiah began to move through the shadows with purpose. He no longer thought of freedom as an idea. He thought of it as architecture. And like any structure, it needed design, foundation, and faith. He called it the covenant. It began as whispers, phrases passed in hymns, gestures made while carrying cotton, numbers carved into the wood of feed troughs. To the colonel's eyes, it was nothing. To those who understood, it was everything. It was on the night when the plantation slept and the moon cooled the world into silver and shadow. Josiah gathered a handful of men and women at the edge of the swamp. No torches, no fire, only voices. They didn't pray for deliverance. They planned for it. Maps drawn in the dirt. Routes to the marshes. Safe houses marked not by names but by songs. He taught them how to read the land, how moss always faces north, how rivers can hide you if you walk through them, not beside them. He taught them the code of silence, the language of looks. Even the smallest child learned when to run, when to listen, when to pretend ignorance. Catherine began noticing strange things, too. Servants pausing mid-task when Josiah passed by. Songs that changed their rhythm when her father entered the room. Eyes that met briefly, as if sharing a secret older than the plantation itself. One night, she followed him, barefoot, silent, moving through the cypress mist until she reached the edge of the swamp. There she saw them, dozens of figures standing in a circle, heads bowed, singing a song that wasn't sorrowful. It was a promise. When Josiah lifted his hand, the song stopped. He spoke only one sentence. Freedom is not a moment. It is a method. Catherine didn't understand the full meaning. Not yet. But she felt something awaken inside her, a tremor of guilt, awe, and danger all at once. And as she turned to leave, one of the women in the circle looked up and met her eyes. There was no fear in that gaze. Only recognition. The covenant had begun, and Hollowbrook would never be silent again. Colonel Harrove could smell disobedience. He had lived long enough to know when men were afraid of him, and when they were pretending to be. After Sarah's escape, something in der Shanget. Too many glances. Too many silences. Too much thinking. He didn't yet know about the covenant, but he felt it. Like a vibration under the skin of the plantation. Something hidden, alive, growing. So he began watching Josiah. Every move, every word, every pause that lasted 1 second too long. The colonel's logic was simple. Power survives through fear. But fear is like salt. Use too much and you poison the well. Josiah noticed the shift immediately. Orders came harsher. Ration smaller. The colonel's sermons more frequent. And one night, while Josiah was teaching by the swamp, a young boy, no older than 10, ran into the circle gasping for air. "They know," he said. Someone told them. Betrayal. The one thing Josiah could not prepare for. The colonel's men came before dawn, dogs howling, torches cutting, troops of folk. They found nothing. The covenant had vanished into the marsh. But Josiah's overseer's quarters were torn apart. His ledgers burned. And by sunrise, one man was missing, Eli. A friend. A brother. The one Josiah had taught first to read. Catherine watched from her window as her father ordered Eli's body hung from the oak by the cotton press. The message was clear, obedience or death. But when Josiah stood beneath that tree, his face betrayed nothing. No grief, no rage. Just sie längs so heavy it frickt net even solltes. That night, Catherine found him sitting alone near the stables, staring at the dirt. She whispered, "He betrayed you." Josiah didn't look up. "No," he said. "Fear betrayed him. The man only carried it." He picked up a handful of soil and let it fall slowly through his fingers. "Every rebellion must feed the earth before it feeds the people." Then he stood, walked back into the dark, and began rewriting his plans, sharper this time, colder, quieter. He no longer believed in mercy, only momentum. And as he disappeared into the trees, Catherine realized she wasn't watching a servant anymore. She was watching a man who had decided to become history. Sunday came heavy with heat. The bells rang from the small wooden chapel, the one the colonel built to remind his slaves of obedience. He called it God's house, but Josiah knew better. It was an altar to control, verses twisted into chains, hymns turned into warnings. But that morning the colonel was ill. A fever. And when authority weakens, silence becomes opportunity. Josiah stepped up to the pulpit. And as an overseer. Not as a slave. As submitting Else. The crowd starred, men, women, children, all still, all waiting. Catherine sat in the back pew, pretending she was only there out of curiosity. But she could feel it too, the air shifting, the script changing. Josiah opened the Bible, his voice low, deliberate. He read from Exodus, "Let my people go." Then he closed the book. "Do you know what Pharaoh feared most?" he asked. Not freedom, not rebellion. He feared memory. He feared what would happen if those who forgot who they were suddenly remembered. He looked over the crowd. Eyes met eyes, heads lifted. No one breathed. "The masters think they own your bodies," he said. "But they don't know what lives behind your eyes. They don't know that a seed can sleep in dirt for 1,000 years and still rise." His words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Every syllable carried the weight of something ancient, older than the fields, older than America itself. He spoke of Egypt, of deliverance, of a God who listened in the silence. And then he changed the rhythm. The sermon became a code. He spoke in parables only the covenant would understand. The river runs north this season. The harvest will come under the Tiertmoon. Catherine realized she wasn't hearing a sermon. She was hearing a strategy disguised as salvation. When it ended, the people didn't clap or shout. They just stood, eyes burning, hearts awake. And somewhere deep in the back, a woman began to hum. It wasn't the old sorrowful tune of Hollowbrook. It was new, defiant, rising. Later, as Catherine walked home, she whispered to herself, "That turned God into a weapon." And she was right. Because Josiah had just discovered the most powerful truth of all. When you teach the enslaved to pray in code, even heaven becomes an accomplice to rebellion. The fever came for Colonel Harrove like judgment. One day he was shouting orders. The next, he was a ghost in his own house, sweating, delirious, babbling scripture through cracked lips. The doctor called it malaria. Catherine kellet it submitting Else. Retribution. The plantation slowed. Without the colonel's hand to guide the cruelty, the structure began to tilt. Orders became delayed, banishments, forgotten. The overseers hesitated. And in that hesitation, Josiah saw possibility. Catherine spent her days tending to her father, washing his skin, spooning broth between his teeth. At night, when the air cooled and the moans subsided, she walked outside just to breathe. And always she found him there. Josiah. Standing near the barn, silent, watchful, like the night itself was listening to him. At first, the conversations were cautious. About work, about weather, about noting. But soon, nothing turned into everything. She asked about the stars, why some moved faster than others. He told her about navigation, how slaves used the constellations to find freedom. She asked if he believed in God. He said, "I believe in justice. If God agrees, then we're on the same side." Every word he spoke seemed to peel something from her, layer by layer, until all that was left was a woman who no longer believed in her own world. She began sneaking food to the workers, books to the children, and one night she did something no daughter of a master had ever done. She handed Josiah her father's keys. "Only for the ledgers," she whispered. But she knew that wasn't true. She wanted him to use them. She wanted him to win. The moonlight made her face almost translucent, fragile and fierce at once. Josiah took the keys slowly, their hands brushing. It was the briefest touch, but it burned through both of them. He looked at her, this pale extension of his enemy, and said quietly, "You don't know what you're offering." "Yes, I do," she said. And for the first time she didn't sound like a girl from the big house. She sounded like someone who had just crossed an invisible line and could never go back. When she turned to leave, Josiah whispered after her, "Eve Empire falls from Witen. Sometimes it only takes one believer." And as she disappeared into the house, he knew. Hollowbrook was beginning to collapse, not from fire, but from love. The colonel's ledgers smelled of leather and dust, the faint tang of tobacco and old ink. To any man they were simply accounts, cotton sold, supplies purchased, debts recorded. To Josiah they were the lifeblood of Hollowbrook, a map of every weakness, every dependency, every blind spot the master believed unassailable. That night, with Catherine's keys heavy in his palm, he unlocked the study and stepped into a world built on complacency. Rows of numbers leapt off the page, payments to overseers, bribes to local officials, loans taken against future harvests. Everything was there, perfectly recorded, perfectly predictable. Josiah smiled. He had waited for this. Every overconfidence, every habit the colonel had thought invisible, every routine that lulled him to sleep, it was all a tool now. He traced the flow of money, the movement of goods. He noted where the coffle payments came from, how the markets could be manipulated, which overseers were greedy and easily persuaded. Every dollar accounted for a life enslaved, every entry a chain, and now Josiah was about to bend those chains to his will. For weeks he worked in silence. Small errors appeared, an overseer underpaid, a shipment delayed, a note lost in transit. Nothing traced to him, nothing obvious. But gradually the plantation's operations began to shift, imperceptibly, invisibly, like a tide slowly eroding a cliff. Catherine became his accomplice. She found the small discrepancies first. An invoice missing, a payment redirected, a ledger subtly annotated in code only they could read. Together they orchestrated Hollowbrook's finances from the shadows, turning wealth into a weapon. By the time the colonel noticed, it was too late. The accounts made sense on the surface, but underneath the numbers sang a different tune, a tune that only Josiah and the Covenant could hear. It was a theft unlike any other. Not of cotton, not of gold, but of control itself. He didn't need violence. He didn't need threat. He needed knowledge, patience, and the willingness to let others play their part in his symphony. That night, Josiah closed the ledger and whispered to Catherine, "The master counts his money, but he will never count his failures. Not until it's too late." And she nodded. Because now the plantation itself was betraying him, brick by brick, number by number. By winter's edge, Hollowbrook was no longer just a plantation. It was a network. A labyrinth of silent orders and coded gestures. Every worker, every child, every hidden ally became a node in a system the colonel could not see. Josiah taught them the language of survival, subtle, invisible, untraceable. A twist of a hat brim meant danger. A foot tappet in heightem meant Medo nicht. A dropped bundle of cotton marked a safe path to the swamp. Even the songs were altered. What the colonel heard as the usual field chants, complaints, prayers, or boredom, were messages, warnings, and instructions. Pick the third row by moonlight, one lyric would instruct. Move south if overseer approaches, another would signal. Catherine watched, fascinated and terrified. She began marking secret symbols in the margins of books, marginalia only Josiah and she could decipher. Letters were hidden in church sermons, books left on porches, gestures made while carrying water. Every day, Hollowbrook itself became a classroom in insurgency. One evening, under the gray sweep of clouds, Josiah gathered the most trusted workers in the barn. He laid out a map carved into wood. Every barn, every field, every door had a symbol. Every symbol carried a meaning that the colonel's eyes could not read. "We do not fight yet," Josiah said. "We build. We teach. We observe. When the time comes, the land itself will rise for us." They nodded, their breaths fogging in the cold barn air. It was dangerous, intoxicating, terrifying. Every whispered message was a gamble. Every gesture a rebellion. Catherine lingered near the back, absorbing every nuance. She realized that Josiah's genius was not just in action, it was in invisibility. By the time anyone realized what was happening, Hollowbrook would already belong to the people who had been enslaved there. Josiah looked at her, and for the first time allowed a shadow of a smile. "Knowledge," he said, "is the only weapon they cannot take from us. And a weapon that moves silently cannot be stopped." That night, as the wind swept through the cotton rows, Hollowbrook whispered back, "Not a single chain klinget." Not a single overseer noticed. But everyone listening with the right ears, with faith, understood a storm was coming. January had turned Hollowbrook brittle. The frost clung to the cotton like silver lace. The colonel's fever had passed, but fear remained, creeping, unspoken, haunting his every step. He believed the plantation was intact. Josiah knew it was already cracking. The first strike was not dramatic. It was surgical. A barn door left unlocked. A few bundles of cotton lost. A shipment delayed. The colonel fumed, called for overseers, demanded explanations. All he got was silence. A silence that had teeth. Josiah watched from the shadows, his eyes calculating every response. He didn't want chaos yet. He wanted realization. The first strike wasn't about rebellion, it was about awakening. He summoned the covenant that night. 23 voices gathered in the barn, cold air biting their skin. He spoke calmly, almost kindly. "Tu nicht, you will do something you have never done. You will act as if Hollowbrook already belongs to you. Do not be rash. Do not be seen. Do not fail." They moved like smoke through the trees, invisible hands adjusting, moving, opening and closing, disrupting without trace. Each person performed a task they had practiced in silence for months. Every movement a code. Every glance an order. By dawn, the colonel found several small but critical acts of sabotage. Tools hidden, a wagon wheel removed, a gate left open. He stormed through the fields, screaming at the workers. But they looked at him as they always had, obedient, respectful, almost fearful. And yet something in their eyes betrayed a quiet understanding he could not name. Catherine watched from the back porch, heart hammering. She saw Josiah at the edge of the field, calm as a shadow, commanding without speaking. And she understood something terrifying and exhilarating. He had already won. Not with guns, not with fire, but with minds aligned and disciplined in secrecy. Josiah returned to the barn that night. The faces of his people were lit by a single candle, each reflecting relief, pride, and fear. He said only, "Tonight was the first strike. The next will be louder. And by the third, they will know that their world has changed." Catherine realized then that the revolution was no longer a plan. It was a living organism. It breathed through the fields, moved through the swamp and whispered through every corridor of the big house. Hollowbrook's bones were shaking, and the people who had built it with chains and cotton could feel it. Keswin Wolket trok the frost, bitten fields that night, herbrit misting in the kolte. The stars above were pale, indifferent witnesses. She carried with her a small satchel, keys, papers, and a resolve that frightened her more than the shadows. Josiah was waiting at the edge of the swamp, silent like a sentinel of the night. The Covenant's members were hidden nearby, watching, waiting for her signal. "Are you certain?" he asked. His voice was calm, steady, but there was a weight to it that made her tremble. "Yes," she said. And she meant it. Not because she trusted him blindly, but because she had realized the world she had known, the world of her father, of Hollowbrook, of comfort built on cruelty, was already dead. That night she crossed the line, not with words, not with ceremony, but with an act of total allegiance. She handed Josiah a small bundle of the colonel's most secret ledgers, financial records, letters, and correspondence with neighboring planters. Every document a key to dismantling the power structure she had been born into. He took them slowly, reverently, as if accepting an offering. Her fingers brushed his, a spark that burned through years of conditioning, fear, and social expectation. It was forbidden, dangerous, and intoxicating all at once. "Once you give this," he said, "there is no turning back. Not for you, not for me, not for Hollowbrook." "I understand," she whispered. And in that instant she ceased to be merely the colonel's daughter. She became an agent of something larger, a revolution that lived in shadows, whispered in songs, and pulsed in secret codes. The swamp held its breath. The stars held their watch. And somewhere deep in the big house, Colonel Harrove slept, unaware that his empire was being quietly handed to the people he had enslaved. Catherine returned to her room with a quiet smile that frightened her. It was the smile of a conspirator, of a woman who had made a choice that would stain her forever. And yet it was also the smile of someone who had finally seen the truth. Josiah, standing in the cold night, looked toward Hollowbrook's heart, the main house, the fields, the quarters. Everything he had worked for, every lesson taught, every silent signal sent, was now within reach. And Catherine's choice had accelerated the inevitable. The game had changed. The players had shifted. And the plantation itself, its walls, its orders, its very soil, began to hum with the pulse of revolution. Josiah knew that Hollowbrook alone could not survive. A single plantation was a spark, but a network could become wildfire. He began reaching out quietly, invisibly, to those whose voices had been silenced for decades. At first it was subtle. A coded note left in a hymn book at a neighboring church. A whispered message to a cook passing through on market day. A glance at the right moment, a symbol scratched into a fence post, easily mistaken for idle mark-making. The Covenant expanded without detection. Workers from distant fields began to understand signals they had never seen before. Messages traveled faster than any overseer could follow. Orders were executed before suspicion could even arise. Josiah trained them as he had trained Hollowbrook. Every gesture deliberate, every word measured, every movement meaningful. Children carried intelligence without knowing it. Mothers delivered messages in song. Fathers guided entire crews with a single glance. Catherine became the eyes and ears inside Hollowbrook. She memorized the colonel's habits, intercepted his letters, and ensured that every plan moved forward without trace. Together, she and Josiah orchestrated a symphony of hidden action that reached beyond the plantation's borders. By spring, the Covenant was no longer just a group of conspirators. It was a system, a silent, living organism that pulsed through the fields, through the swamp, into the neighboring counties. Every act of labor became a statement of power, every routine a potential signal. And the colonel, blind to what had grown beneath his nose, continued to believe his slaves were obedient. But Josiah knew better. He had seen fear turn to hope. Hope turned to knowledge. The knowledge, when disciplined, became unstoppable. One night, as they reviewed the latest messages, Catherine leaned close and whispered, "How many know now?" "Enough to change everything," Josiah replied. "Enough to make every master question his world. Then soon enough to make them powerless." The night I carried the hum of rebellion. The trace, the fields, the swamp, all zammed to enclosure, listening, waiting. Hollowbrook had become more than a plantation. It had become a node in a network no white man could ever see. And Josiah knew with certainty that the first open strike would not be the last. It would be the beginning of an unstoppable storm, born of patience, cunning, and the courage of the unseen. The cotton harvest was in full swing. The sun beat down on Hollowbrook's fields, relentless and merciless. Colonel Harrove believed this would be the moment of proof that his system still functioned, that obedience reigned. He did not see the storm gathering beneath the soil, in the eyes of his workers, in the quiet glances exchanged over rows of white stalks. Josiah had chosen this moment carefully. The overseers were predictable, their arrogance a tool he wielded like a scalpel. He had observed their routines, noted their weaknesses, and planted subtle misdirections, a missing tool here, a delayed instruction there. Every small disruption, a test of loyalty, a probe to see who would follow the colonel blindly and who might falter under pressure. That afternoon, a group of overseers arrived at the eastern field, ready to scold and punish. They found the rows of cotton strangely misaligned, the workers calmly continuing their tasks as if nothing had happened. Confusion flickered in their eyes, and hesitation is all Josiah needed. From the shadows, Hazingwald, the Covenant. A tap of the hoe, a shift in posture, a barely audible whistle, and the hidden workers moved with precision. Bundles of cotton were discreetly relocated. Tools were accidentally broken. Small sabotage disguised as carelessness. The overseers' frustration grew, their authority undermined without anyone pointing directly at them. They argued among themselves, their anger blinding them to the truth. Hollowbrook was no longer theirs to command. Catherine, perched near the barn, observed silently. She had provided the keys, passed the codes, and ensured the plan moved forward without leaving a trace of her hand. She felt a thrill of fear and power, the first taste of real complicity, the intoxicating scent of control turned upside down. The sunset, the harvest was complete. Yet the colonel's pride was bruised. He could sense something was off, though he could not name it. Every overseer returned to report, every worker feigned exhaustion, every calculation Josiah had made held true. And in the quiet aftermath, Josiah gathered his people. "You saw today," he said, voice steady, eyes glowing. "This is what obedience looks like when it obeys a higher order. This is the first proof that even under chains, we can bend the world to our will." The plantation trembled that night, not with gunfire, not with screams, but with the invisible pulse of rebellion. Hollowbrook had learned to whisper. And soon it would roar. Winter had settled over Hollowbrook like a heavy cloak, frosting the cotton and silencing the fields. Inside the largest slave cabin, the air was thick with anticipation, candlelight flickering across faces tense with fear and resolve. This was the Winter Council, the first formal meeting of the Covenant. Josiah stood at the center, maps spread across a rough-hewn table, numbers and symbols marking every corner of the plantation. He traced the routes of supply, patrols, and neighbor watchmen. Every door, every barn, every field, accounted for, coded, prepared for action. "This is no longer about small acts," he said, voice low, commanding, hypnotic. "We are about to take Hollowbrook into our hands. What we do now will be remembered by no history books. What we do now will be erased if we fail, and if we succeed, it will reshape this land forever." The workers listened, absorbing every word like soldiers receiving orders for a battle they had never imagined fighting. Josiah spoke of coordination, who would move when, how to communicate silently, how to neutralize resistance without alerting the colonel until it was too late. Every contingency was planned, betrayals anticipated, weaknesses exploited, alliances secured. Catherine sat nearby, her fingers tracing the edge of a ledger she had memorized. She had crossed lines she could never return from. But here, in this cabin, she was no longer merely a daughter of Hollowbrook. She was a participant in something enormous, something terrifying, and yet irresistibly alive. Josiah paused, eyes sweeping the group. "Remember," he said, "we are not merely escaping, but remaking. The plantation belongs to those who work it, not those who claim it. And we will act as one, with patience, precision, and silence." The room was silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire. Every person present understood the stakes. Capture meant death, discovery meant brutality beyond imagining. Yet the choice was clear: risk and action, or continued chains and obedience. By the council's end, every participant knew their role. Every signal, every route, every contingency was etched into memory. The Winter Council had forged a plan that was impossible to trace, unbreakable if executed correctly. As the participants returned to their quarters, the night air carried a new tension, one born of purpose. Hollowbrook no longer belonged to the colonel. It belonged in spirit to the people who had sustained it for decades. Josiah lingered by the fire, whispering to Catherine, "When the time comes, they will see us not as slaves, but as masters of our own destiny. And no one, not even your father, will stop it." The night was black ink, the moon a pale witness hovering up off Hollowbrook. Wind swept through the cotton fields, bending the stalks like silent sentinels. Every shadow was a possibility, every sound a threat. Josiah moved quietly among the quarters, checking, observing, ensuring that the covenant was ready. The workers were tense but resolute. Some whispered final instructions. Others touched symbols hidden in clothing, bedding, or tools, reminders of their silent language. Every gesture, every movement communicated readiness. Trust had become the most dangerous currency in the plantation. Catherine stayed close to the big house, memorizing guard rotations, listening to the colonel's heavy snores, counting every breath, every step, every unguarded moment. Her role was pivotal. She would guide Josiah and the most trusted members into positions that would decide life or death. Josiah gathered the core leaders of the covenant near the edge of the swamp. He looked at each face, young, old, weary, resolute. "This night is ours," he said, voice calm, low, commanding. "No one else can control it. We strike not with impulse, but with strategy. And we move as one. We do not hesitate. We do not falter." The plan was simple, terrifying in its clarity. Oversee the big house, secure the gates, neutralize any loyal overseers, and protect the quartered workers. Everything depended on precision and silence. Mistakes would be catastrophic. Success would rewrite every law, every rule, every assumption in Pike County. Catherine whispered a final confirmation to Josiah, a subtle gesture that the paths were clear. They shared no words, only understanding. In that moment, the daughter of the colonel was not a witness, but an architect of upheaval. Iwer Krieg of the floorboards, iwer shift of the wind, iwer distant berg of a hound hiked in at the tension. Time itself seemed suspended, waiting for the first move. The plantation, once a symbol of absolute control, now trembled under the weight of invisible forces poised to strike. Josiah took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the night. He thought of the years of planning, the lessons taught, the bonds forged in secrecy. One mistake and decades of oppression could crush them all. One move and the impossible could be achieved. He looked to the workers, to Catherine, to the shadows around them. The moment was coming. And when it arrived, Hollowbrook would never be the same again. The first shot never rang out. It did not need to. Josiah moved like a shadow through the colonel's house, every step measured, every breath deliberate. The colonel slept unaware, a man lulled into complacency by decades of assumed dominance. The gates clicked under the hands of the covenant. The fields remained eerily quiet. Tools lay in prearranged positions, pathways were blocked and cleared according to plan. Every enslaved worker knew exactly where to be, exactly what to do. Silence was their weapon, and it struck harder than any whip. Beside the big house, Josiah confronted the colonel. The struggle was brief but decisive. One shot, the colonel's own pistol, ended the illusion of authority forever. Catherine Harrove, standing frozen in the doorway, Savno der Killer bat al Liberator. Her father's death was instantaneous, but the collapse of power would echo far longer. Outside, the Covenant moved with surgical precision. Overseers were disarmed, locked in the barns, or quietly guided out of harm's way. Workers secured the perimeter, preventing any reinforcements from entering unnoticed. Every action was pre-planned, rehearsed, and executed with terrifying efficiency. Catherine stepped into the night beside Josiah. For the first time there was no veil of secrecy between them. Her allegiance was absolute, her presence a testament to the transformation that had been months in the making. Together they moved through Hollowbrook, ensuring control of the main house, the storehouses, and the escape routes. By dawn, Hollowbrook belonged to the people who had been enslaved there for decades. The fields, the barns, the very soil seemed to hum with a new energy, one born of courage, planning, and silent rebellion. Neighbors would later whisper of fires and shadows, but no one could trace the revolt to its mastermind. Josiah stood in the main hall, looking at the colonel's belongings, the furniture, the portraits. He had inherited more than a house. He had claimed a symbol. Hollowbrook was no longer a plantation. It was a fortress, a statement, a testament to what knowledge, strategy, and patience could achieve. That night, as the Covenant celebrated quietly, Josiah spoke to those who had risked everything. We are free, but freedom is not mere absence of chains. It is mastery of ourselves, our land, and our destiny. And this is only the beginning. Dawn broke over Hollowbrook with a pale, unforgiving light. The fields glistened with frost, but the energy in the air was hotter than any summer sun. Josiah walked among the workers, no longer overseer, no longer hidden, but leader. He looked into their eyes, seeing the same mixture of fear, triumph, and cautious wonder that mirrored his own. Catherine moved beside him, cataloging the changes, who could be trusted, who needed guidance, who would help sustain what had been won. She understood something essential. The revolt was not just an act of violence. It was an education in power, an unspoken test that would define the next chapter of every life under Hollowbrook's roofs. The neighboring planters were stunned. News traveled slowly, but the shock was immediate. Hollowbrook had vanished from their control overnight. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others trembled at the thought that if one plantation could fall, others could follow. Josiah and Catherine worked quickly, establishing rules and order, not from cruelty, but from necessity. Every decision was deliberate. The crops must be harvested, defenses maintained, and communication lines secured. The plantation, once a tool of oppression, became a laboratory for autonomy, strategy, and survival. Fear among the enslaved had transformed into confidence. Tasks once performed under the lash were now executed with pride and purpose. The knowledge Josiah had imparted, reading, arithmetic, strategic planning, became their armor. And for the first time, they understood that freedom was not granted. It was claimed, protected, and expanded. Catherine kept her presence close, her intellect and insight crucial in guiding the group. She was no longer merely a participant. She was a co-architect of this new order. The psychological shift was profound. Power now rested where labor and knowledge intersected, not in inherited titles or fear. Meanwhile, rumors of Hollowbrook's uprising spread quietly among other plantations. The fear it inspired was more potent than bullets or fire. It was the awareness that control could be broken, that the impossible could be realized through strategy, courage, and hidden knowledge. Josiah gathered the group at night beneath the same stars that had witnessed their planning. They spoke. History remembers those who obey. We will be remembered for what we create. And from this night forward, Hollowbrook is proof that freedom is not a gift but a conquest. The land itself seemed to pulse with the echo of transformation. Hollowbrook was no longer a plantation. It was a statement, a fortress of knowledge and a warning to those who believed dominion was eternal. The days after the revolt were a delicate balance of triumph and tension. Hollowbrook had been seized, yet the work of consolidation required more than courage. It demanded trust, insight, and alignment. Josiah and Catherine moved through the plantation with a synchronized understanding that few could perceive. Every glance, every gesture, every shared decision was a subtle communication of strategy and intent. The danger they had faced together had forged a bond stronger than simple loyalty. It was a bond tempered in secrecy, rebellion, and mutual recognition of power. Catherine had shed the role of passive daughter long ago. She was no longer merely an observer or facilitator. She was an architect of the new order. Her intellect, her daring, and her willingness to cross lines, forbidden to women of her class, made her indispensable. And Josiah saw it in the tilt of her head, in the confidence with which she commanded attention, in the way she anticipated problems before they arose. One evening, as they inspected the perimeter, a shared silence fell over them. The plantation had never felt so alive, so watchful, so responsive to their presence. And in that silence, something unspoken shifted. It was no longer solely about Hollowbrook or about survival. It was about the intertwined fates of two people who had dared to defy the world. "You've changed everything here," Catherine said quietly, voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Josiah's eyes met hers, steady, piercing, aware of the gravity behind her words. "This is only the beginning," he replied. "But some lines are ours to define." From that moment, strategy and desire intertwined. Their collaboration became a force, blending intellect with emotion, calculated risk with instinctive trust. Ihre Decision, ihre Movement across Hollowbrook carried a dual purpose, survival and connection. The plantation became a stage for both rebellion and intimacy, a theater where trust and danger merged seamlessly. By night, the two moved through the quarters and fields, ensuring loyalty, safety, and order. By candlelight, they shared knowledge, strategies, and secret histories that could not survive daylight scrutiny. And in private moments, their relationship deepened, a forbidden alliance born of shared vision and danger, a bond that neither fear nor convention could sever. Hollowbrook had taught them power. Together they began to explore the uncharted territory of authority intertwined with human connection. Their unity became both shield and sword, a force invisible to outsiders yet unstoppable from within. In Tose nichts, Josiah unterstot so meeting elemental. Freedom was not just control of land or lives. It was the capacity to shape bonds, influence hearts, and command loyalty in ways that defied expectation. And Catherine, once a pawn of inheritance, had become the most dangerous and indispensable ally he had ever known. Hollowbrook's revolt did not remain a secret for long. Whispers traveled across Pike County, carried on the wind, through the laborers' networks, and even in the guarded gossip of neighboring planters. The impossibility of the act, a slave-led seizure of an entire plantation, became a specter haunting every estate in the region. Josiah understood the power of perception. Fear was a weapon as potent as any firearm, and knowledge was the blade that wielded it. He began to reach beyond Hollowbrook, carefully, subtly, using trusted couriers and coded messages to connect with other enslaved workers on neighboring plantations. Every communication was deliberate, every letter disguised, every instruction layered with contingencies. The network grew slowly like roots treading trug fatile Säule, unsehen yet unstoppable. Workers learned to read maps, recognize signals, and interpret subtle cues, a literacy that carried power rather than punishment. Josiah taught them strategy, patience, and discretion. They learned that rebellion was not just a burst of fury, but a calculated orchestration of risk, timing, and coordination. Catherine played her part with equal precision. Her knowledge of social hierarchies, her understanding of human psychology, and her ability to mask intentions behind the guise of propriety made her an invaluable strategist. Through her subtle influence, contacts were cultivated, alliances formed, and even sympathetic overseers were gently coaxed into passive compliance. The neighboring planters began to notice changes. Tools misplaced, accounts that didn't add up, whispers of unrest, all subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to seed paranoia. And Josiah ensured that these incidents never left traces that could be directly linked to him or Hollowbrook. It was a delicate dance, demonstrating power without inviting immediate retaliation. Overnight, the network convened in secret. Candlelight illuminated maps, sketches, and coded symbols on walls. The conversations were a blend of strategy, encouragement, and lessons in history, stories of resistance, rebellions elsewhere, and the unshakable principle that even entrenched power could fall. By the end of the winter, Hollowbrook was no longer just a reclaimed plantation. It had become the nucleus of a growing movement, a model, a symbol, and a command center for rebellion that could reach far beyond its fences. And through it all, Josiah and Catherine remained the unyielding center, a partnership forged in danger and sharpened by vision. Hollowbrook's walls held more than cotton and tools now. They held knowledge, strategy, and a network poised to challenge every assumption of authority in the Deep South. The Rippler had begun, and soon the waters of Pike County would tremble under its force. Spring arrived with a deceptive softness masking the tension that gripped Hollowbrook. The network Josiah had built was growing, but every expansion brought risk. A whisper in the wrong ear, a neighbor too curious, a courier too careless, and decades of careful planning could collapse overnight. One evening, a message arrived from a nearby plantation, carried by a young worker whose hands trembled despite courage. It spoke of an opportunity, an alliance with another group of enslaved workers ready to rise, but also contained a warning. Someone within Josiah's own circle had been talking. The possibility of betrayal hung over the room like a storm cloud, thick and suffocating. Josiah summoned the core leaders to the main cabin. Catherine moved silently beside him, her eyes scanning faces, reading expressions like maps. The same quiet intelligence that had guided the revolt now served as a shield against subtle threats. "We have enemies we cannot see," Josiah said, voice low, precise, commanding. "Not all betrayal wears a mask of malice. Some betray by fear, some by hope, some by misunderstanding. But betrayal is a force we must anticipate. It is as real as any patrol or gun." The leaders listened, tension visible in every line of their bodies. They had fought together, risked everything, yet the knowledge that one misstep could unravel Hollowbrook weighed heavily. Josiah moved among them, questioning, observing, reading between words and silences. Trust was not assumed, it was tested over and over until loyalty became a visible force. Catherine took a step forward. "Even fear can be harnessed," she said, voice steady. "Even those who falter can serve the purpose of the network if guided carefully. We do not waste energy on punishment. We convert weakness into strength, hesitation into preparation." A week passed in quiet surveillance and careful probing. Every signal was analyzed, every rumor traced, every courier shadowed. Finally, Josiah identified the source, not an enemy, not a spy, but a young worker untested in the weight of such secrets. Rather than harsh punishment, he guided the worker, teaching caution, the value of discretion, and the power of alignment with the larger vision. The test had strengthened the network rather than weakened it. The Covenant learned that loyalty was not inherited, but forged. Betrayal, real or imagined, became a tool to sharpen vigilance, not a cause for panic. Josiah and Catherine stood together that night on the porch, looking out over the plantation. Every shadow seemed alive with possibility, every rustle a reminder that control was fragile yet achievable. They understood now that the true power of Hollowbrook was not in guns or gates, but in minds aligned, purpose clear, and vigilance unending. The harvest season arrived, heavy with the scent of cotton and the weight of anticipation. Hollowbrook was alive with activity, but this was no longer labor under oppression. Every worker moved with purpose, every action calculated, every task imbued with a sense of autonomy and responsibility. Josiah walked among them, observing, correcting, guiding. He was no longer just a leader. He was a strategist, a mentor, a presence that shaped thought as much as action. The plantation itself had become an extension of his mind, a living system of efficiency, loyalty, and controlled force. Catherine, ever his confidant and equal, managed logistics with a sharp eye and subtle hand. She communicated orders, anticipated threats, and shaped alliances without ever drawing suspicion from the outside. Her knowledge of human behavior, her ability to read fear and desire made her indispensable. Together, they were a dual force, intellect and intuition fused into leadership. Every day brought new tests. Neighboring planters noticed anomalies, missing tools, altered schedules, whispers of defiance. But none could trace it back to Hollowbrook. Josiah had learned to use fear, expectation, and perception as weapons just as effectively as any musket. Inside the quarters, the enslaved workers had transformed. Education, strategy, and empowerment had replaced fear and obedience. They were no longer laborers chained by circumstance. They were custodians of a vision. Their understanding of the plantation's operations gave them a confidence that was nearly tangible. Every interaction, every plan, every act of work was now a rehearsal for survival and autonomy. But Josiah knew the harvest was more than cotton. It was a harvest of secrets, of power consolidated, of minds aligned with purpose. Every success reinforced loyalty, every minor misstep corrected in a way that strengthened discipline rather than breaking spirit. Hollowbrook was a fortress, not built of walls but of knowledge, strategy, and unbreakable resolve. Catherine observed the horizon one evening, the last light of day falling across the fields. "I can feel it," she said softly. "Every neighbor, every overseer, they sense the change. They don't know what it is, but they feel it. Hollowbrook is no longer a plantation, it is an idea. And ideas are far harder to kill than men." Josiah placed a hand on her shoulder. "The harvest is never just what we reap in cotton. It is what we reap in control, in minds, in preparation. Hollowbrook is ours, not just today, but in the influence it casts outward. And soon others will follow the path we begun." By the final day of the harvest, the plantation had become a model of autonomous power, a proof that disciplined strategy and aligned loyalty could overturn centuries of assumed dominion. The soil itself seemed to hum with the energy of minds awakened, and bonds forged in fire and secrecy. Word of Hollowbrook's revolt had spread beyond whispers. Neighboring planters, fueled by outrage and fear, began to conspire in silence. The idea that enslaved people could seize power, control land, and operate independently was an affront to everything they believed. And the more they feared, the more desperate they became to restore dominance. One evening, Josiah and Catherine received news that a small group of armed men had been spotted scouting Hollowbrook. They were cautious, testing defenses, observing routines, calculating vulnerabilities. The network had anticipated this moment, and yet, knowing it was coming, did little to ease the tension that gnawed at the edges of Hollowbrook's newfound security. Josiah called a meeting of the Covenant under the cover of darkness. The workers gathered, faces illuminated by candlelight, shadows dancing across determined eyes. "The enemy will test us," Josiah said, voice low and commanding. "They will look for weakness. They will assume fear can be exploited. But fear is now our ally. We know it, we control it, and we will use it to outthink them at every step." The first skirmish was subtle. A horse, left tethered near the edge of the property, vanished overnight. Footprints traced, then abruptly ended. The group realized this was no random theft, a message, a probe. Hollowbrook had been seen, measured, and judged. And now the reaction would come. Catherine coordinated the defenses with precision. Barricades were reinforced, watch rotations adjusted, escape routes secured, and signals established for immediate communication across the plantation. Every worker had a role, every action accounted for. The plantation had become a chessboard, and Hollowbrook's defenders were both pieces and players. The psychological warfare began before the physical confrontation. Planters spread rumors of retaliation, threats, bribes, and promises of brutal consequences. Some enslaved workers felt unease creeping back, a flicker of doubt amid their newfound courage. But Josiah and Catherine reminded them, power is built not only through action, but through anticipation, discipline, and shared conviction. As night fell, the first real confrontation came, a small team sent to intimidate, now confronted by a united, prepared, and intelligent Hollowbrook. They found no easy targets, only calculated resistance. The fight was quick, decisive, and without unnecessary bloodshed. The message was clear: Hollowbrook would not be taken lightly. Josiah watched the horizon afterward, knowing this was only the beginning. The planters would escalate. Every encounter would test loyalty, courage, and the network's ability to respond. And Hollowbrook had to survive not just by brute force, but by the mastery of strategy, psychology, and foresight. News of Hollowbrook's revolt, its resilience, and the audacity of its leadership spread like wildfire, carried by word-of-mouth, whispers, and the subtle networks Josiah had cultivated. Across Pike County and even into neighboring plantations, enslaved workers began to speak in coded language, sharing stories of the plantation that had risen from bondage. Hollowbrook had become more than land or buildings. It was now an idea, a blueprint of resistance, a living testament to what could be achieved when courage, strategy, and intellect intersected. And ideas, once planted, are nearly impossible to extinguish. Josiah understood. He knew that inspiration could be as powerful as gunpowder, and fear could be as potent as any whip. He carefully allowed the stories to spread, ensuring that every account of Hollowbrook emphasized both discipline and intelligence, courage and precision. The details of tactics were hidden, but the impression of invincibility was absolute. Catherine monitored the Ripley effects. She saw how subtle fear began to creep into the minds of the planters, how doubt entered conversations in the fields and drawing rooms alike. Their control, once assumed unbreakable, was now visibly shaken. And among the enslaved workers of other plantations, a new energy surged: curiosity, hope, the dangerous desire to see if Hollowbrook's model could be replicated. The network expanded subtly, with Josiah sending trusted envoys to share knowledge under the cover of night. Letters disguised as innocuous correspondence, small gifts carrying instructions, whispered lessons in literacy and strategy, all carefully orchestrated to seed empowerment without detection. Each interaction strengthened bonds, built loyalty, and widened the sphere of influence without provoking immediate retaliation. Hollowbrook became a psychological weapon. Neighbors measured it, feared it, and yet could not dismantle what was no longer just physical property. It existed in minds and hearts, in courage, calculation, and the quiet but unyielding assertion of freedom. The enslaved workers themselves began to recognize the power of symbolism. Every harvested bale of cotton, every cleared field, every strategic victory over external threats became more than labor. It was proof of autonomy, intelligence, and collective will. Hollowbrook was no longer a plantation. It was a statement. Freedom could be claimed, defended, and expanded, even in the heart of oppression. And in the midst of all this, just Josiah and Catherine stood together, aware that their vision had grown beyond their immediate control. The revolt had become contagious, a spark that could ignite others, and the forces they opposed now confronted a new reality, that power could no longer be assumed to reside only with the planters. Hollowbrook had transcended itself. It had become a symbol, one that could not be ignored, and one that would shape the consciousness of the South in ways few could yet comprehend. By late spring, the calm that had allowed Hollowbrook to flourish began to crack. Neighboring planters, enraged and terrified, began to coordinate. Private militias, hired guns, and even local law enforcement took notice. The ripple effect of Hollowbrook's defiance had reached ears of power that could no longer ignore the threat. Josiah knew the danger had escalated. The first probes had been minor, almost symbolic. Now strategy alone would not suffice. Vigilance had to merge with preparation for real conflict. Perimeter, every worker, every routine, had to be evaluated and reinforced. A plantation had become a fortress, not built with stone, but with intelligence, loyalty, and foresight. Catherine worked tirelessly, mapping the social and psychological terrain. She understood that fear and perception could be wielded just as decisively as weapons. Letters arrived, threats disguised as legal notices, rumors of bounty hunters, and rumors designed to fracture morale. She intercepted some, subtly redirected others, and ensured that the narrative Hollowbrook controlled remained one of defiance, competence, and strategic inevitability. Josiah convened the inner council. The message was clear. Every neighbor, every militia, every opportunist could act. Yet Hollowbrook had advantages the outside could not see: intelligence, preparation, and unity. Every worker had become a participant in strategy, every field a controlled variable, every cabin a potential observation post. The first real assault was carefully orchestrated by a coalition of local planters who had grown impatient. They arrived under the guise of negotiation, but with intentions unmistakable to Hollowbrook's eyes. Spies, lookouts, and a network of signals ensured that the moment the planters moved beyond bluff, they would confront an organized and prepared defense. Hollowbrook did not react with chaos, it reacted with precision. The planters were forced to retreat after a series of minor, carefully calculated confrontations. No lives were lost, but the message was clear: Hollowbrook would resist, and any assault would be met with strategy and vigilance rather than blind fury. Josiah knew this was only the beginning. Every success emboldened Hollowbrook, but it also sharpened the resolve of the planters. The circle of threats was tightening, pressure building from all directions. The plantation, once a haven of strategic learning and empowerment, now teetered on the edge of a larger storm, one that would test loyalty, courage, and the limits of human ingenuity. Catherine placed her hand on Josiah's arm that evening, voice low, firm. "It will come again, and next time with more than caution. But we are ready, not just to defend, but to expand the idea of Hollowbrook beyond these fields." Josiah nodded, eyes scanning the horizon where dusk and shadow mingled. The pressure was real, the stakes unthinkable, yet Hollowbrook had learned that defiance, intelligence, and unity could carve freedom even from the most oppressive soil. The threat encircling Hollowbrook was real, immediate, and relentless. But Josiah saw it not merely as danger, but as opportunity. Every patrol, every suspicious visitor, every whisper of law or militia approaching was a chance to strengthen alliances, to expand the network, to turn fear into power. He began reaching beyond the plantation's fences in earnest. Trusted envoys carried messages to nearby plantations, coded in letters disguised as mundane correspondence, an extra thread in the tapestry of secrecy. The network spread like a living organism, each node feeding intelligence, strategy, and hope back to Hollowbrook. It was invisible, resilient, and growing faster than any planter could anticipate. Catherine played a key role. Her understanding of the social hierarchies among planters allowed her to identify potential allies and neutral parties. She guided envoys to sympathetic quarters, subtly influencing overseers and laborers alike. Her strategy was precise: never force, never expose, always inspire and co-opt, ensuring that the network remained hidden in plain sight. By midsummer, Hollowbrook was no longer just a plantation. It had become a hub of coordination, a command center for a burgeoning resistance. Workers trained in literacy, strategy, and observation were dispatched to neighboring properties under the guise of routine labor, carrying knowledge, coded signals, and encouragement. Every visit, every interaction, every whispered word expanded the web of defiance. Planters grew increasingly uneasy. Rumors of Hollowbrook's influence became harder to suppress. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, but the pattern was unmistakable. Workers on multiple estates displayed subtle coordination, confidence, and self-determination that had not existed before. Hollowbrook had become a psychological weapon, a source of hope for some, a cause of terror for others. Josiah understood the delicate balance. Every expansion of the network increased risk. A single misstep could expose months of careful planning. Yet he also knew that movement required boldness. Freedom could not be defended in isolation. It had to spread, infiltrate, and connect with others willing to challenge the established order. Catherine leaned close one night as they watched the horizon together. "The storm is coming," she said. "But so is the revolution." "Hollowbrook is no longer a plantation. It is a seed of a larger world, one we can shape if we stay disciplined, patient, and cunning." Josiah nodded. The network was growing, the movement taking root, and every threat only made their strategy sharper. They were no longer reacting, they were orchestrating the conditions of defiance, turning fear and oppression into tools of empowerment. Hollowbrook's vision now stretched beyond its fences. It was no longer about surviving the immediate danger. It was about planting the idea of freedom in the hearts of every oppressed soul in the region, a fire that could not easily be extinguished. The region had been simmering with tension for months, but nothing could prepare Hollowbrook for the catalyst that arrived one sweltering August night. A neighboring plantation, seeking to intimidate and punish any hint of defiance, executed a horrific act. A young worker caught in a minor act of resistance was publicly whipped and sold away in chains, his family forced to watch. News of the brutality spread faster than fire across dry grass. Schock, Grief and Anger rippelt outward, reefing plantations miles away. But in Hollowbrook, the response was different. The workers, hardened by training, education, and shared purpose, did not panic. They saw opportunity within outrage. The injustice became a clear illustration of why Hollowbrook's vision, autonomy, strategy, and collective control was not just desirable but necessary. Josiah convened the council immediately. Every leader understood the stakes. The act could provoke reckless retaliation, yet it also offered the perfect moment to expand influence. "This is the world as it truly is," Josiah said, voice low, razor sharp. "Every atrocity strengthens the chains of those who remain passive. But here we turn horror into resolve. We teach, we guide, we act strategically. We do not strike blindly. We make the system itself tremble with calculated pressure." The council moved quickly. Envoys spread word to nearby plantations, offering protection, guidance, and subtle coordination for those willing to resist. The event ignited suppressed anger in the hearts of many, and Hollowbrook became a symbol of both hope and defiance overnight. Workers elsewhere began questioning authority, testing limits, and finding small ways to assert autonomy, inspired by the knowledge that organized resistance was possible. Catherine meticulously managed communications, ensuring the ripple effect could grow without exposing Hollowbrook itself. Letters disguised as casual updates, stories told in coded conversation, and subtle signals across the countryside created a web that stretched further than any planter could predict. By the time the news reached Pike County's courts and local militias, the network was already self-propagating, resistant to suppression. Josiah watched from the porch one evening, candlelight reflecting in his eyes. "Their cruelty has become our strategy," he said. "Every act of oppression fuels the fire of awareness, courage, and honesty. We're no longer reacting. We're shaping the conditions of rebellion, teaching others to see the world as it truly is and to claim power they were told they could never hold." Hollowbrook's influence spread, now unstoppable in its momentum. The brutal act, intended to instill fear, instead illuminated the possibility of freedom, strategy, and collective strength. The network had moved beyond secrecy. It had become a movement, and the region would never be the same. Hollowbrook had become more than a plantation. It was a living experiment in defiance, strategy, and human potential. But the story is not just theirs. It is yours if you choose to see it. Every act of courage, every moment of planning, every choice to rise above oppression carries a lesson that reaches beyond time, beyond place. You are standing at the edge of that same precipice. Every word you hear, every detail you absorb is a seed of transformation. And now comes your moment to act, not with cotton or chains, not with guns or fear, but with intention. If you understand the power of choice, the weight of agency, and the danger of complacency, comment "The fire moves within" twice. Type it slowly, deliberately. Let the words resonate, letting your mind recognize the subtle shift that comes with claiming awareness, claiming knowledge, claiming a spark of control over the forces that shape your life. The first comment affirms recognition. You see the structure, the hidden pressures, the systems of control that exist in every corner of society. The second comment affirms commitment. You are choosing to move beyond passive observation, to step into a space where strategy, knowledge, and foresight become tools, not abstractions. Catherine and Josiah understood this instinctively. Every action they took was deliberate, every step calculated to assert autonomy and influence. You, too, can step into a deliberate practice of awareness, seeing the invisible patterns, understanding the psychology of control, and choosing your path amidst forces designed to keep you constrained. Write it now. Le fire moves witten. And again, one more time. Feel the weight of the words. Notice how the rhythm, the intent, and the acknowledgement begin to align with a new perception. This is not a simple ritual. It is the first step in aligning thought with strategy, awareness with action, insight with execution. It mirrors the very lessons Hollowbrook offers: preparation, education, foresight, and the courage to act when the moment arrives. And as you commit these words to the page, remember, transformation begins quietly in small, deliberate steps. Every thought, every observation, every subtle act of awareness builds the foundation for power. Just like Hollowbrook, the moment is fleeting. Seize it, internalize it, and let it shape the decisions you make from this moment forward. The calm that had followed the symbolic victories shattered like glass under a hammer. Planters, militia, and hired mercenaries converged on Hollowbrook with a ferocity born of fear, desperation, and wounded pride. This was no longer a test of subtlety or strategy alone. It was a full-scale assault on a vision they could not tolerate. Josiah had anticipated this. He had prepared, trained, and educated his people for months, but the reality of seeing organized violence descending on their home tested nerves, courage, and resolve. Every watchtower, every hidden passage, every contingency plan was activated. Hollowbrook became a living organism, responsive, adaptive, and deadly in its precision. The first skirmishes were violent, but calculated. Shots fired, horses stampeded, small units of attackers repelled by defensive positions cleverly camouflaged within the terrain. Hollowbrook's defenders were not just workers, they were strategists, tacticians, and masters of improvisation. Every move by the attackers was anticipated, every reaction measured. Catherine coordinated logistics, ensuring food, water, and medical needs were met even under siege. She moved silently among the workers, issuing commands that carried authority, calm, and clarity. Her presence reinforced the psychological edge. The attackers saw not fear, but an organized, intelligent, unyielding force. Josiah watched the horizon, reading movements like lines of a map only he could interpret. Every attack, every feint, every attempt to intimidate was met with countermeasures that combined discipline, deception, and precision. Hollowbrook was no longer merely defending itself, it was demonstrating a principle. Power resides in knowledge, unity, and preparation. The psychological impact on the attackers was profound. Rumors spread of Hollowbrook's defenders anticipating every move, of traps laid with deadly efficiency, of an intelligence behind the resistance that defied the expectations of any planter accustomed to blind obedience from enslaved workers. The fear that had driven the initial assault now returned to haunt those who believed control was theirs by birthright. By nightfall, the attackers were forced to withdraw. They left bruised egos, shattered confidence, and a growing recognition that Hollowbrook was not merely a plantation. It was a fortress of intellect, courage, and strategy. Josiah and Catherine had not only defended their home, but demonstrated the terrifying reality that power can shift when knowledge and foresight meet action. Hollowbrook had survived, but the lessons were clear. The system would continue to strike, and every victory would invite greater challenges. And yet, each challenge only strengthened the resolve, discipline, and sophistication of the movement growing quietly across the South. Amid the chaos and constant threat, a quieter, more profound transformation took place. Josiah and Catherine, bound by shared purpose, mutual respect, and the intensity of survival, moved beyond partnership into something deeper, trust forged in the crucible of rebellion. Their union was not simply personal. It was a strategic consolidation of influence, a merging of knowledge, resources, and legitimacy. Catherine's understanding of planter society, law, and negotiation complemented Josiah's mastery of strategy, leadership, and clandestine operations. Together, they were unstoppable, not merely surviving, but shaping the world around them. The marriage was conducted in secrecy, far from the eyes of suspicious neighbors and prying lawmen. symbolized something far greater than love alone, the fusion of insight, courage, and calculated vision. Within the walls of Hollowbrook, it became a declaration. The enslaved had agency, strategy, and the ability to redefine the structures that sought to contain them. Their bond also served as a psychological anchor for the network. Workers, envoys, and allies saw the alliance and understood leadership was not fragile, it was cohesive, deliberate, and committed. The union of Josiah and Catherine became a symbol of unity between intellect and courage, freedom and strategy. It reminded everyone involved that Hollowbrook was more than a plantation. It was a vision of autonomous power. In private, the marriage was a sanctuary of planning and reflection. Conversations went far beyond the personal. Every intimate discussion was also a rehearsal of tactics, contingency planning, and long-term vision. They spoke openly of threats, psychological manipulation, and the steps needed to ensure Hollowbrook's influence could survive and expand. But the marriage also humanized the rebellion. Amid the strategy, training, and constant threat, it reminded everyone that freedom and loyalty were not just abstract concepts, but lived, embodied experiences. Catherine's courage was contagious. Josiah's decisiveness was inspiring. Together, they transformed Hollowbrook into a place where strategy, intellect, courage, and emotion coexisted, fueling a movement that no external force could easily extinguish. Outside Hollowbrook, rumors of the marriage spread quietly, adding a new layer of fear among planters. The enslaved were not only resisting, they were organized, disciplined, and led by a pair whose combined knowledge and audacity could not be underestimated. By uniting, Josiah and Catherine solidified not only their personal bond, but the operational integrity of the network itself. Their marriage became both a shield and a symbol, the heart of Hollowbrook's power, demonstrating that rebellion, strategy, and vision could converge into something unstoppable. By the autumn following the assault, Hollowbrook had evolved from a singular fortress into a model for organized defiance. Its success could not remain hidden, and subtle whispers of strategy, empowerment, and autonomy traveled quietly across the South. Workers on distant plantations began noticing small changes, discreet literacy, coordination in labor, subtle signals among the enslaved, and even minor acts of sabotage. Josiah recognized that influence was a weapon as powerful as any militia. Through trusted envoys and coded communication, he shared lessons learned, discipline, unity, psychological insight, and contingency planning. He taught others to read the invisible rules of their oppression, to detect weakness, and to exploit it with precision. Hollowbrook's model became a blueprint, adaptable, resilient, and hidden in plain sight. Catherine orchestrated the logistics. She ensured letters and messages carried not just instruction, but hope, the understanding that rebellion was possible without reckless exposure. Her strategic eye allowed Hollowbrook to expand influence while remaining insulated from direct retaliation. Every plantation that absorbed these lessons added strength to a network that grew invisibly, like roots beneath the soil. The planters began to sense a shift they could neither fully explain nor immediately control. Workers on multiple estates started acting with coordination, resisting in ways subtle yet undeniable. Small economies were reorganized quietly, alliances formed in shadow, and the fear that had maintained control for generations began to fracture. Hollowbrook's philosophy was simple yet revolutionary. Knowledge is power, unity is protection, and strategic patience is lethal. Every act of observation, every lesson taught, every small success built toward a larger vision, a decentralized, sustaining system of resistance that no single threat could extinguish. By winter, Hollowbrook's influence extended far beyond Pike County. Its name became both whispered hope and unspoken dread, a symbol that autonomy, intelligence, and courage could overcome entrenched oppression. Planters realized that suppression alone could not contain the ripple of strategic awareness that Hollowbrook had unleashed. Josiah and Catherine understood the stakes. This expansion made them more dangerous, but also more essential. Their network was no longer reactive, it had become proactive, shaping the conditions under which freedom and power could take root across the region. And every person who embraced the principles of Hollowbrook became another node in a movement that, though hidden, was unstoppable in its logic, discipline, and vision. Hollowbrook had moved from survival to revolution. its principles spreading like wildfire beneath the surface of a society unprepared for intelligence and unity among the oppressed. The expansion of Hollowbrook did not go unnoticed. Planters, local authorities, and state militias recognized a threat they could not fully understand, a network built on knowledge, strategy, and disciplined unity that defied centuries of control. Fear transformed into aggression, and the old order prepared its counterattack with meticulous calculation. Legal measures were employed first. Warrants were issued under vague pretenses, investigations were launched, and spies were planted to infiltrate Hollowbrook's network. Militias patrolled the surrounding counties, watching for any signs of coordinated resistance. Letters were intercepted, coded messages scrutinized, and the pressure on Josiah's network intensified with every passing day. Yet Hollowbrook was not caught off guard. Months of preparation had turned the plantation into a fortress of intelligence. Contingencies had been rehearsed, escape routes mapped, and signals created to alert workers and allies to any threat. Every move by the authorities was anticipated, and every countermeasure was precise, leaving the attackers frustrated and off balance. Psychology became a weapon. Josiah understood fear, authority, and perception better than any planter or lawman. False trails were left, decoys employed, and misinformation spread strategically to confuse and misdirect. The authorities, operating under the assumption that control could only come from brute force, underestimated the power of coordination, insight, and patience. Catherine managed the social and symbolic dimensions of resistance. She ensured Hollowbrook's network maintained cohesion, morale, and discipline even under scrutiny. Every worker, every ally was reminded that their unity and intelligence were their strongest weapons. Hollowbrook became not just a site of survival, but a psychological fortress, turning the oppressors' tactics into evidence of their own desperation and weakness. The pressure increased, yet the network thrived. Each threat strengthened bonds, sharpened strategy, and expanded awareness across the region. The authorities' attempts at suppression revealed their vulnerability, exposing the limitations of a system built on fear and coercion. By the end of the year, it was clear Hollowbrook could not be destroyed by conventional force. Its influence, its philosophy, and its network had become a living, adaptive structure. Every legal attack, every patrol, every attempt to intimidate only validated the intelligence, foresight, and unity that Josiah and Catherine had cultivated. Hollowbrook had transcended the physical plantation. It was now an idea, a model, a strategy that could survive, adapt, and spread even under the most ruthless opposition. And in that resilience, the old order discovered its greatest vulnerability. It had underestimated what could emerge when knowledge, courage, and unity converged. Hollowbrook's story does not end with a single battle, a single rebellion, or even a single victory. Its power lies in endurance, in the ideas, strategies, and principles that survive beyond walls, beyond fences, beyond the reach of any authority. Josiah and Catherine understood that freedom was not granted, it was engineered. Every act of planning, every subtle communication, every lesson taught in shadow became a brick in a structure that no whip, no law, no militia could dismantle. Hollowbrook became proof that knowledge, foresight, and disciplined unity could challenge any system built on fear, oppression, and ignorance. The old order would continue to rage, to patrol, to legislate, to intimidate. But the network Josiah created, the model Catherine sustained, had proven a truth that could not be erased. Control is fragile when confronted with strategy and insight. Hollowbrook inspired not just rebellion, but a methodology for resistance. Its lessons traveled quietly across the South, carried in whispers, letters, and the subtle acts of countless individuals who refused to accept a predetermined fate. And this is the final revelation. The real power of Hollowbrook is not in the plantation, the gun, or even the leaders. It is in the mind. It is in seeing the invisible structures of control, understanding their weaknesses, and choosing action with discipline and foresight. It is in realizing that true agency comes from preparation, unity, and courage, and that even in the darkest systems, strategy can create freedom. Josiah and Catherine's story challenges every man who hears it. How will you confront the invisible systems that govern your world? Will you remain passive, or will you learn, observe, and act with precision? The principles of Hollowbrook, awareness, intelligence, unity, patience, and calculated courage, are not confined to history. They exist here and now within the choices you make every day. Remember, history is not written by the powerless. It is written by those who understand, who strategize, and who dare. Josiah and Catherine did not wait for permission, nor did they rely on hope alone. They created conditions where freedom was inevitable, even in a world designed to deny it. And now, having witnessed the rise of Hollowbrook, you hold the same potential. The question is no longer about them. It is about you. Will you say the Shanks aren't you? Will you recognize the opportunities to reclaim agency? Will you act with the strategy, courage, and foresight that history rewards in those who refuse to be bound? Hollowbrook endures, not as a place, but as a blueprint, a living, dangerous truth that will awaken every man willing to understand the depth of power, resistance, and transformation.